Chernobyl was a nuclear power plant located 3 kilometers from the city of Pripyat in Ukraine, which housed approximately 50,000 residents. During the early hours of April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 of the power plant exploded, resulting in the worst nuclear catastrophe the world has seen. The construction of the power plant began in 1977, and by 1983, 4 reactors had been completed. It was planned to create 12 reactors altogether. However, Reactor 5 was 70% completed when the explosion occurred, and everything got cancelled in 1989, 3 days before the third anniversary of the explosion. Chernobyl used 4 RBMK 1000 reactors, which were able to produce 1 gigawatt of power, producing roughly 10% of Ukraine's electricity power at the time. The RBMK 1000 reactors used graphite rods to moderate the reactivity. However, the main flaw in this reactor was the positive void coefficient, which meant that as the core became more reactive, it produced more heat, which increased the overall heat of the water, creating more steam bubbles, and thus making the core even more reactive, and eventually creating a positive feedback loop which caused the explosion. Before Chernobyl, the first fatal nuclear disaster was the explosion of the SL-1 reactor in 1961, created by the US, which resulted in 3 deaths, but this was nowhere near as fatal as Chernobyl.
The Unit 4 reactor was to be shut down on the night of the 25th of April for routine maintenance, and the engineers decided to take advantage of this to determine whether or not, in the event of a power outage, the turbines could provide enough electricity to operate the main cooling water pumps until the diesel generators took over. This type of test was attempted the previous year, but the power delivered from the turbine fell too rapidly, so it was decided to repeat the test with the new voltage regulators. Unfortunately, this test was thought only to concern the non-nuclear workforce of the plant, and thus the proper information needed to carry the test out was not exchanged between the team in charge of the test and the team in charge of the safety of the reactor. Therefore, adequate safety precautions were not carried out in the test, and the operators were not alerted to the nuclear safety implications and the potential dangers. The planned procedure involves shutting down the reactor's emergency core cooling system, or ECCS, which is responsible for providing water to cool the core in case of an emergency. This demonstrated a relaxed attitude and lack of awareness for safety protocol. As the shutdown of the reactor continued, the reactor was operating at half power when the output power of the reactor dropped due to an increasing amount of xenon, a byproduct of the nuclear reaction usually burnt away instantly. For the test, the reactor power output should have been stabilized at 1,000 megawatts, but due to a combination of operational error and xenon poisoning, the power output went down to 13 megawatts. Efforts to increase the power were met with frustration from the engineers as they began removing the control rods to increase the activity of the reaction, but this was a violation of the minimum operating reactivity margin, as a minimum of 15 control rods had to be left inside the reactor when only 8 were kept. In an RBMK reactor, the water is used as an efficient coolant and neutron moderator, but by increasing the void coefficient, the amount of steam and temperature inside the reactor increases. The reactor was stabilized at 200 megawatts, and although this was insufficient power, the engineers decided to continue with the test anyway, as they thought that there was a fail-safe which would insert all the control rods halting the reaction. Because the coolant pumps had been shut off, the remaining water inside the reactor core is quickly converted into steam, and the remnants of the xenon are burnt away, and this causes the power output to surge, and in response to this, the engineers pressed the fail-safe button, inserting all the control rods. Unfortunately, unbeknownst to the engineers, the control rods had graphite tips, which is known to accelerate the reaction, and this massively increased the power output, leading to large increase in pressure and ultimately an explosion. The disaster at the power plant, along with the subsequent fires within the reactor's wreckage, led to the formation and distribution of a radioactive cloud that spread through not only Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, but also much of Europe and as far as Canada. 203 people were taken to the hospital right away, of which 31 died. The majority of these affected were firefighters and rescue personnel attempting to get the situation under control, unaware of the dangers of their exposure to radiation from the radioactive debris. A total of 135,000 people were evacuated from large cities, with 50,000 from the nearby town of Pripyat. Workers who participated with the cleanup, known as liquidators, were exposed to high levels of radiation. They had to remove pieces of the graphite control rods from the roof of the reactor building in 90-second shifts, as that was the maximum amount of time they could be exposed to the radiation, and only they could do it, as robots could not survive the radiation. Helicopter crews had to risk being exposed to massive amounts of radiation by flying directly above the burning reactor core to drop a mixture of sand to stop the flames and boron to reduce reactivity. The cleanup of the 30-kilometer exclusion zone around the reactor included between 300 and 600,000 individuals, but several of them arrived 2 years after the incident. as they could only work for a certain amount of time before they absorbed too much radiation. Only on the second day after the catastrophe did Soviet military authorities begin evacuating people from the Chernobyl region 36 hours after the incident. All those living within a 30-kilometer radius of the plant had been relocated by May of 1986. Major radiation, on the other hand, influenced the atmosphere on a much larger scale than the 30-kilometer range encompasses, as an increased level of radioactivity was detected as far west as Canada. Many adolescents in the populated areas received high doses of radiation to their thyroids of up to 50 gray, a unit of measurement used to quantify the amount of ionizing radiation absorbed, primarily because of consuming radioactive iodine-131 from contaminated milk provided locally. The vegetation in the exclusion zone had to be bulldozed and buried, and during the human evacuations, livestock was removed. Radioactivity levels in different natural food sources were investigated elsewhere in Europe. Fish in deep freshwater lakes were prohibited for resale in both Sweden and Finland, and landowners were told not to eat them.
There were many long-term effects which took place due to the explosion, impacting both wildlife and the humans directly exposed to the radiation. The radiation traveled as far as 500 kilometers away. However, these radiation particles are more insignificant. The 30-kilometer exclusion zone around the plant was where the radiation has caused the land to be inhabitable. It was observed that after 3 months, there was 20,000 cases of thyroid problems in patients under the age of 18, and 700 of these cases were fatal cases among the youth, which shows that the radiation is fatal for children and adolescents. 5,000 of these cases of thyroid cancer were most likely caused due to children drinking contaminated milk from the cows feeding on contaminated grass. Thankfully, the fertility rate of the residents were not impacted or extremely minor due to the low dosage of radiation in the body. The majority of the severe cases, such as leukemia and cardiovascular problems, were present in the rescue team and the cleanup team, where both experienced a high radiation dose in a short time. It was shown that 60% of the cleanup team suffered from lymphocytic leukemia within the 26 years of research. The effects of Chernobyl are still present to this day. As of 2015, it was shown that 6,000 children are born with genetic heart defects in Ukraine. And unfortunately, 85% of Belarus's children are carrying genetic markers which could cause health issues, which can also be passed down to their children. The long-term effects of the fallout on the environment were also harmful. It's been observed that the trees in the exclusion zone are growing at a much slower rate than before, and that the majority of the insects and animals show large doses of radiation. Some of the birds have mutated to have smaller brains than normal birds. It was also observed that the red forests that died due to the explosion have not decayed 15 to 20 years after the explosion, which means that even the decomposers of the ecosystem have been impacted by the radiation.
When we look at the ethical analysis of the incident, we're going to consider the two things: the code of conduct of engineers, relevant for the time, and the framework for making ethical decisions. For the code of conduct, we're looking at the National Society of Professional Engineers Code for 1980, which states the engineer will have proper regard for safety, health, and welfare of the public, and he will also notify the proper authority of any observed conditions which endanger public safety and health. Which is clear that from the experiments that they were doing, that this was not the case. Moving on to the next slide. We're going to be looking at the consequentialist framework while referencing back to the code of conduct. With the disaster itself, it is clear that they did not consider the consequences of what they were doing, and here's a manner of ways. Firstly, they decided to run a test and reactor that was being shut down for routine maintenance, which means that there may have been issues with the reactor, which they decided not to look into as it hadn't been checked yet. They didn't take into consideration the dangers of using real radioactive materials, which links back to the reactor being maintenance. When doing this, they didn't consider that should anything go wrong, it would cause widespread effects both on the health of the people nearby and the natural world as a whole. When they did this experiment about talking to their colleagues about it, they took away their choice to be part of the experiment or near the dangers that were taking place. And they also didn't speak to the people in charge of health and safety, who would have given checks and balances to make sure it's safe and cause disaster. They could have had input which could have avoided the incident and ensured that everything was done in a safe manner. They didn't have any plans for should anything go wrong. And it's shown by the myriad of decisions, such as reducing the power output and then not having a backup plan should it not speed up again in time. They didn't have methods to ensure that the fail-safe was safe, shown by the graphite rods exploding and increasing the rate of the reaction. And they didn't have any sort of warning system in place to alert everyone to the dangers of what's happening. Going on to the next slide. We'll do a look at the handling of it and the duty framework. So the duty of care to the people underneath them. We can look at the officials who reacted too late, as they took 18 hours to get any group of officials together to talk about the incident. And they didn't alert the citizens of what was happening until 36 hours after. And even then, that was too late, as they didn't prepare them to have to evacuate, as they didn't want to release any information, which is another feeling of the government, which is also shown with the guidelines saying that evacuation wasn't yet necessary. And no one wanted to act and put out the order in case they lost their job, which shows the lack of duty of care towards the citizens over their own position in the government. The largest failing of duty was the lives lost, starting from the volunteers who put themselves in position to help and look after and deal with the explosion. For example, the 3 men whose lives were lost, clearing out the water underneath the core. And this is shown by them saying, we're going to send 3 men to their deaths. The lives lost of the children, such as the ones who lost their lives to fire cancer, and also the entirety of Europe, which was in the blossom. From this, the only good that came from this incident was the updating of the rules of the International Atomic Energy Association, where they came up with new rules and regulations when dealing with atomic waste and nuclear plants, which would affect the future and is still being affected today. It was shown by the Fukushima explosion, where they had to re-update their rules, and it shows that there is a current and ongoing attempt to update them to the safest they can be.
So looking at the future of sort of nuclear power, an ethical question we can ask straight off the back is, with the threat of climate change increasing, should we turn to nuclear power or not? Evidently, we have some pros and cons for this. Evidently, a benefit of nuclear power is that it has quite a low carbon emission. So, we won't speed up the rate of climate change, as quick. However, as seen with what my colleagues have just explained, the cons of nuclear power is things like, Chernobyl. When it goes wrong, it is sort of a large, sort of hazardous environment that gets created, and there's quite a lot of human life lost. Next slide, please. So another sort of con and ethical consideration we have to do with nuclear power is the nuclear waste. We have 2 types of nuclear waste. We have high-level waste and low-level waste. Low-level waste is something that we can handle the majority of. So either this low-level waste is sort of left in the plant where it's made until sort of it's no longer radioactive, and we just let the half-lives pass around, and then we can sort of dispose of this waste sort of sensibly and cleanly. However, some stuff might be turned into sort of radioactive protection for workers. However, the more ethical sort of consumption here is the high-level waste. The high-level waste is stuff that we can't deal with and have to sort of fill into landslides and hurt the environment in order for sort of to protect us as humans from it. Next slide, please. Moving on, some alternatives to nuclear energy. We got thorium, which is like the baby brother of uranium. It's a lot more cleaner, a little bit more efficient sort of energy resource, and countries are starting to try and promote this over uranium. We also have solar power, which is a renewable resource that we can harness the power of the sun, and there's little to no carbon emissions with this. And then we have natural gas and hydrogen, which are also they're better for the environment and whatnot, but also have the same problem as uranium and nuclear energy. If there is a problem and there is an explosion of some sort, this still causes some ethical consideration because there could be a loss of human life. Next slide, please. Thank you for listening to our presentation.